Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. The island had always kept time by the rhythm of waves against ancient stone and the patient sweep of light across dark waters. For 37 years, Tobias had climbed those spiral stairs each evening, his weathered hands lighting the beacon that guided souls safely through fog and uncertainty. But on this September night, when the air carried autumn's first whisper and the sea hummed with unusual quietness, something shifted in the careful order of things. The lighthouse keeper had been feeling the weight of his years more heavily lately. His joints ached with approaching weather, and his eyes, though still sharp enough to spot a ship's lantern miles away, grew heavy earlier each evening. As he settled into his familiar chair beside the great lens, watching the beam cut its eternal path across the water, a profound weariness settled over him like a gentle tide. The chair welcomed him the way old chairs do when they know your weight and your weariness, and for the first time in nearly 4 decades, Tobias let his chin find his chest as the sea's lullaby rose from below the cliff. In the whitewashed cottage that leaned slightly toward the harbor, Elena Moreau stood at the edge of her own wave. Her husband Jacques paced the small rooms with the particular anxiety that comes with waiting for miracles, while Elena breathed through sensations that seemed to match the ocean's own rhythm. The midwife, Mrs. Cordelia, arrived with her worn leather bag and the calm competence that came from delivering 3 generations of island children, moving through the cottage with unusual reverence, as if guided by intuition deeper than training. As the night deepened and Eleanor's time drew near, the island seemed to hold its breath. The wind, usually restless against the cottage windows, gentled to barely a whisper. The tide, due to turn an hour ago, held itself in perfect suspension. Even the seabirds, usually restless in their cliffside nests, settled into unusual stillness. In the lighthouse tower, the great lens continued its rotation, as if guided by some intelligence deeper than human vigilance, while Tobias dozed in his chair for the first time in his long career. When Luna finally emerged into the world, she didn't cry. Instead, a soft humming filled the room, not from the baby's throat, but from somewhere around her, as if the air itself was singing a lullaby. Eleanor, exhausted but alert, reached for her daughter with trembling hands, and as she drew the child to her chest, something impossible happened. The shadows in the room, cast by the oil lamp, by the furniture, by their own bodies, began to lean toward the baby like flowers turning toward sunlight. Mrs. Cordelia, who prided herself on practical thinking, blinked hard and looked again. But there it was, shadows behaving as shadows should not behave, drawn by some invisible magnetism toward this tiny new life. She said nothing. What words could capture such a thing? But she made careful note of the time and the way the lamplight seemed to soften, gathering at the edges of the cradle like a silent, watchful audience. At that exact moment, Tobias startled awake in his chair, his heart racing with the sudden certainty that something important had happened. He looked out across the water, expecting to see a ship in distress, but found only peaceful darkness and his faithful beam cutting its path through the night. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the world had shifted somehow, that the careful balance he'd spent decades maintaining had found a new center point. The lighthouse beam swept across the cottage, and this time it paused just for a heartbeat, just long enough to acknowledge the miracle taking place in that small room below. The powerful ray, usually so precise and unwavering, lingered a moment longer than physics should have allowed, bathing the birthing room in golden, ethereal light, before continuing its journey across the dark waters. It was barely perceptible, a subtle anomaly that only a few noticed, but it etched itself into memory like a quiet confirmation that this child was born not just on the island, but of its deepest mysteries. This gentle bending of reality, this subtle insistence on deeper connection, was what the islanders would later come to call the infinite madness. Not a madness of chaos or delusion, but a profound awareness of the interconnectedness of all things, a recognition that the world was far more tenderly woven than most people dared to imagine. It was an overwhelming understanding that love and wonder flow between all living things like an endless ocean, connecting every heart to every other heart in patterns too beautiful for any single mind to fully comprehend. Luna lay in her mother's embrace, a tiny vessel of gentle wonder, already pulling at the invisible threads that bound the world together. Her presence was a promise, a soft, unwritten poem unfolding in the tranquil darkness. The humming that had accompanied her birth faded gradually, but the sense of presence remained, settling into the cottage like a blessing that would linger for years to come. As dawn approached and the lighthouse beam finally yielded to natural light, the island began to stir from its enchanted stillness. The tide resumed its ancient rhythm, the wind picked up its restless song, and the seabirds called out their morning greetings. But something had changed in those quiet hours when the lighthouse keeper forgot to dream and a child was born, who would grow up understanding that the world held mysteries far gentler and more beautiful than most people dared to imagine. There are nights when the world rearranges itself without making a mess, when forgotten duties become doorways to wonder. This was one of them, a night that would be remembered not for what went wrong but for what went beautifully, mysteriously right. The mornings that followed Luna's mystical arrival seemed to carry a gentler quality of light, as if the sun itself had learned something about patience during that night when the lighthouse keeper dozed and shadows leaned toward a newborn's cradle. Elena would carry her daughter to the cottage window each dawn, showing her the slope of the harbor where fishing boats bobbed like patient thoughts, and Luna would watch with an intensity that seemed far beyond her months, as though she were listening to conversations held just beneath the surface of the visible world. She was not a child of sudden noises or sharp demands. Instead, Luna moved through her early days with an unusual stillness that invited the world to slow down around her. When she made sounds, they were soft, that same mysterious humming that had filled the birthing room, or gentle coos that seemed to harmonize with whatever was happening nearby. Elena found herself humming melodies she'd never learned while nursing her daughter, and Jacques discovered that his perpetual worry about weather and fishing seasons had somehow gentled into thoughtful planning rather than anxious pacing. Mrs. Cordelia, who prided herself on practical thinking, found herself visiting the Moreau cottage more often than medical necessity required. She told herself it was professional curiosity, but deep in her bones she knew she was drawn by something she couldn't name, a quality of attention that felt both restful and alert, like the moment just before dawn, when the world holds its breath in anticipation of light. When the midwife held Luna, her own chronic back pain seemed to ease, though she mentioned this to no one, filing it away as one of those small mysteries that made island life both predictable and wonderfully strange. By Luna's first birthday, the changes had become more noticeable, though still subtle enough that practical people could attribute them to coincidence. The cottage garden, which Elena had always struggled to maintain against the harsh salt air, began flourishing with an abundance that surprised even the island's most experienced gardeners. The tomatoes grew sweeter, the herbs more fragrant, and the flowers seemed to bloom longer than they should have in the coastal climate. Luna would toddle among the plants with the careful attention of someone much older, sometimes pausing beside a wilting stem as if listening to something only she could hear. Within days, those same plants would perk up with renewed vigor, their leaves turning toward the sun with what looked remarkably like gratitude. When Luna began walking at 10 months, earlier than expected, she moved through the world with an awareness that made adults pause and watch. She seemed drawn to people who carried invisible burdens, toddling over to place her small hand on a knee, or simply sitting quietly nearby until some unnamed tension dissolved. Her father, Jacques, was the first to experience this gift directly. During a particularly harsh winter, when storms kept the fishing boats in harbor, he carried his worry like a stone in his chest, pacing the cottage with restless energy that had nowhere to go. One gray afternoon, as he stood at the window watching waves crash against the breakwater, Luna toddled up to him with the determined gait of someone on an important mission. Without hesitation, she reached up and placed her small palm against his chest, not quite over his heart but slightly to the left, where anxiety had been building its nest for weeks. Jacques felt warmth spread from her touch, not physical heat but something deeper, a soothing calm that seemed to seep into his very bones. The tight knot in his stomach began to unravel, his shoulders relaxed, and he found himself breathing deeply for the first time in days. The storm outside continued to rage, but within him a gentle harbor had been found. The most remarkable incident occurred when Luna was 2 years old. Old Henrik, the island's most notorious pessimist, had been struggling with insomnia following the death of his longtime fishing partner. His exhaustion made him increasingly bitter, and even his oldest friends had begun avoiding his sharp complaints about everything from the weather to the government to the general unfairness of existence. One afternoon, as he sat on the harbour bench muttering about life's cruelties, Luna escaped from her mother's watchful eye and walked directly to him. Without invitation or hesitation, she climbed onto the bench beside him, her small presence somehow commanding attention despite her size. Henrik, startled by the boldness of this tiny child, found his complaints dying in his throat. Luna didn't speak. She was still months away from her first clear words, but she placed her small hand on his weathered forearm and simply sat with him. For reasons he couldn't explain, Henrik felt his anger begin to ebb like a tide returning to the sea. They sat together in comfortable silence for nearly an hour, the old fisherman and the toddler, watching boats bob in the harbour while seagulls called overhead. When Elena finally found them, Henrik was sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks, and Luna was humming that same mysterious melody that had accompanied her birth. Even Tobias, the lighthouse keeper, found himself drawn into Luna's gentle orbit. During his evening walks through the village, he would often pause at the Morrow cottage, attracted by the quality of peace that seemed to radiate from their garden like warmth from a hearth. When Luna spotted him through the window, she would wave with the pure enthusiasm that small children reserve for their favorite people, and Tobias would find his perpetual worry about weather patterns and shipping schedules temporarily forgotten, replaced by something that felt remarkably like hope. The lighthouse keeper began to suspect that Luna's unusual birth during his one night of forgotten duty was no coincidence. He had spent decades watching over the island's physical safety, tending the beacon that guided ships through treacherous waters. But this child seemed to be caring for something deeper, the emotional currents that moved through their small community like weather patterns of the heart. It was as if she had been born to complement his work, to tend the invisible tides that could either carry people safely to shore or sweep them away into isolation. Luna herself understood none of this consciously. She simply moved through her days like a small moon in the island's orbit, gently pulling at the unseen threads that connected everything to everything else. Her gift was as natural as breathing, an extension of her very being that required no thought or effort. She was learning the language of tides and whispers, becoming fluent in the subtle communications that flow between hearts, preparing for a purpose that would unfold as naturally as seasons change, as inevitably as the lighthouse beam that swept across the dark waters each night, calling the lost safely home. Time moved differently around Luna, like honey poured from a jar on a warm afternoon, each moment stretching just enough to hold more tenderness than seemed possible. By the time she turned 3, her daily wanderings had carved gentle paths through the village that seemed to follow invisible currents only she could sense. The most well-worn of these paths led inevitably to the lighthouse cottage, where Tobias had begun setting out an extra cup of tea each afternoon, though he told himself it was merely habit rather than hope. The lighthouse keeper had always been a figure apart from the island's daily rhythms, his solitary vigil creating a respectful distance between himself and the community he served. His weathered hands, which had tended the beacon through countless storms, had grown increasingly unsteady as his 70th year approached. The persistent ache in his joints had become a constant companion, sharp reminders of decades spent climbing spiral stairs in all weather, adjusting mechanisms with precision that his aging body found more challenging each passing season. It was Luna who began to change this careful solitude, not through any grand gesture, but simply by appearing at his cottage door with the confidence of someone who had never learned that some people preferred to be left alone. She would arrive carrying small treasures from her wanderings, a piece of sea glass worn smooth by countless tides, a feather from a gull that caught the light just so, or sometimes nothing at all except her own quiet presence. Tobias would grumble good-naturedly about unexpected visitors, but his protests grew weaker each time, and soon he found himself looking forward to the soft knock that announced her arrival. Their afternoons together settled into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Luna would climb onto the worn wooden chair beside his hearth, her small legs swinging freely, while Tobias prepared tea with movements that had grown steadier since her visits began. In the comfortable silence that followed, he found himself sharing stories he had carried alone for decades, tales that emerged not as performances, but as gentle offerings to the quiet attention she gave so freely. He told her about the sea's many moods, how it could cradle a ship like a sleeping child one day, and rage like a wounded beast the next. His voice carried the cadence of waves against stone, as he described the responsibility that came with tending light for others, the weight of knowing that his steadiness might mean the difference between safe harbor and disaster. "A lighthouse doesn't chase after ships in trouble," he would say, his weathered hands wrapped around his teacup. "It stands where it is, steady and true, letting its light be seen by those who need guidance. That's the whole of it, really, being there when you're needed, holding steady when everything else is moving." Luna listened with the particular intensity that had marked her since birth, her dark eyes fixed on his face, as if she were memorizing not just his words but the spaces between them, the gentle pauses where deeper meanings lived. Though she was still months away from speaking in full sentences, she seemed to understand far more than her age should have allowed. When Tobias spoke of the loneliness that came with his calling, she would move closer, her small shoulder resting against his knee. When he described particularly difficult nights when fog was so thick the beam seemed to disappear just feet from the lens, she would place her tiny hand over his heart, and he would feel his anxiety ease into something more manageable. The most remarkable change came gradually, so subtly that Tobias barely noticed it at first. The chronic arthritis that had plagued his hands and knees for years began to feel less insistent during Luna's visits. The sharp pain that usually shot through his fingers when he gripped his teacup would soften to a manageable ache. The stiffness in his knees that made climbing the lighthouse stairs an ordeal would ease enough that he could move with something approaching his old confidence. He attributed these improvements to good weather or better sleep. But the pattern became impossible to ignore. One particularly grey afternoon, when the pain in his shoulder flared with unusual intensity, Luna quietly took his gnarled hand in both of hers. Her touch was feather-light, carrying a warmth that seemed to seep deeper than skin and muscle, reaching the agitated nerves beneath. Tobias felt a sigh escape him, a release he hadn't realized he was holding. The pain didn't vanish entirely, but it retreated like a tide pulling back from the shore, leaving behind a blessed calm. He looked at her then, truly looked, and saw not just a child but a gentle force, a quiet anchor in a world that often felt chaotic and uncertain. Mrs. Cordelia, making her rounds through the village, began to notice the transformation in the lighthouse keeper. His posture seemed straighter, his step more confident, and the perpetual worry lines around his eyes had softened considerably. When she mentioned this observation to Eleanor, the young mother simply smiled and said that Luna had a gift for helping people remember who they were, beneath their worries. It was during this time that Mrs. Cordelia arrived at the Moreau cottage one morning with a small tin of colored pencils that still carried the scent of cedar and a notebook bound in soft blue cloth. "For your observations," she said to Luna, as if documenting the invisible currents of human emotion were the most natural subject in the world. Luna accepted the gift with the solemnity of someone receiving sacred tools, running her small fingers over the smooth cover before opening to the first blank page. She did not draw houses or cats or the simple figures that occupied most children her age. Instead, her pencils traced gentle arcs and flowing paths, loops that reconnected in unexpected places, circles that seemed to hover just above the paper like halos made of patience. Her drawings mapped something invisible but essential, the emotional geography of the island, the currents of worry and joy and loneliness that flowed between hearts like weather patterns of the soul. Tobias, seeing the first of these drawings, sat down heavily in his chair, the way strong people do when they realize they're looking at something both fragile and unbreakable. The lines Luna had drawn traced paths he recognized, the flow of anxiety from the harbor to the houses when storms approached, the gentle eddies of contentment that gathered around the schoolyard during recess, the deep pools of solitude that collected in certain corners of the village where people carried their griefs alone. As autumn deepened and the lighthouse beams swept through earlier darkness, Luna began spending longer hours at the cottage, sometimes staying through the evening ritual of lighting the beacon. Tobias would lift her carefully, mindful of his aging back, and carry her up the spiral stairs to the lamp room where the great lens waited like a sleeping eye. Luna would place her small hands on the brass railing that circled the mechanism and hum softly, not performing but simply being, the way morning sometimes found her in her own garden. The lighthouse seemed to respond to her presence in ways that defied practical explanation. The beam appeared to burn more steadily, cutting through fog with unusual clarity. The clockwork mechanism that turned the lens moved with smoother precision, requiring fewer adjustments throughout the night. Tobias felt his own trembling hands grow steady as he tended the light with Luna beside him, her quiet presence serving as an anchor that helped him remember his own strength. On one particularly stormy evening, when wind howled around the lighthouse with unusual ferocity and waves crashed against the rocks below, with enough force to shake the ancient structure, Luna arrived unexpectedly at the cottage door. She had somehow convinced her parents to let her visit despite the weather, and she climbed the spiral stairs with determination that surprised even Tobias, her small feet finding each step with careful precision. In the lamp room, she simply took his trembling hand in both of hers and stood beside him as he tended the light. Her presence was like finding solid ground in an earthquake, and gradually Tobias felt his panic subside into focused attention. Together they watched the beam cut through the darkness, and he realized that this child understood something essential about his calling that he had almost forgotten in his years of solitary service. As the storm finally began to subside near dawn, Tobias looked down at Luna, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder while maintaining her gentle grip on his hand. He understood then that she had been teaching him something profound about the nature of service, about the power of simply being present without trying to control outcomes. His hands had steadied not because she had performed some miracle, but because her presence had reminded him of his own capacity to be a reliable beacon in uncertain times. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal sweep across calming waters, but now it carried something new, not just the promise of safe navigation, but the deeper assurance that even those who tend the light are not forgotten, that even the lighthouse keepers have their own gentle guides to help them remember their way home to themselves. In her blue notebook, Luna had begun sketching not just the island's emotional currents, but the steady point around which they all seemed to flow, the place where light was kept and tended and shared without condition or expectation, one patient revolution at a time. The blue notebook had become Luna's constant companion by the time she turned 7, its pages gradually filling with drawings that seemed to breathe with their own quiet life. What had begun as simple arcs and flowing lines during her toddler years had evolved into intricate maps that traced territories no conventional cartographer had ever charted. Mrs. Cordelia, who now served as both Luna's teacher and gentle guardian of her unusual gift, watched with growing fascination as the child's artistic language became more sophisticated with each passing month. In the one-room schoolhouse, where island children learned their letters and numbers, Luna would sit at her small wooden desk with the notebook open beside her arithmetic slate. While her classmates dutifully traced A's and B's in neat rows, Luna's colored pencils moved across the blue pages with purposeful precision, mapping not the room's physical geography, but the invisible currents that moved between hearts like weather patterns of the soul. Her drawings showed gentle streams of yellow flowing from the reading corner, where shy Timothy always found refuge, pools of deep blue gathering around Sarah's desk, where homesickness collected like morning dew, and spirals of warm orange radiating from the spot where Mrs. Cordelia stood during story time. At first, these seemed like the imaginative doodles of a creative child. But Mrs. Cordelia began to notice their unsettling accuracy. The dark cloud Luna sketched hovering over Marcus's desk appeared 3 days before the boy arrived, with red-rimmed eyes. Having spent the night listening to his parents argue about troubles, they thought he was too young to understand. The bright burst of silver stars she drew around Emma's chair coincided exactly with the week the girl's grandmother came to visit, filling their small house with stories and laughter that spilled over into schoolwork like sunshine through windows. The most revealing incident occurred when Luna spent an entire afternoon working on a map of the village, her small face creased with unusual concentration. When Mrs. Cordelia glimpsed the drawing, she saw the harbor rendered as a broad breath, inhaling and exhaling in patient arcs, the lanes between cottages traced as soft paths where daily life flowed like gentle streams. But over the postmaster's neat square house, Luna had drawn a heavy cloud of deep purple, so dense it seemed to press against the paper with its own weight. "What does this mean?" Mrs. Cordelia asked softly, pointing to the purple shadow. "Mr. Henderson is very sad," Luna replied with the matter-of-fact tone children use for obvious truths. "All the time. It sits on his house like fog that won't lift." Mrs. Cordelia felt a chill of recognition. The postmaster was known for his meticulous order and quiet pleasantries, always offering a smile and brief word to everyone who visited his office. But he was also a widower who had lost his beloved wife 2 years prior, and no one on the island had ever seen him openly grieve. He simply carried on with stoic determination, maintaining his routines as if consistency alone could hold back the tide of sorrow. That afternoon, Mrs. Cordelia found herself at the post office with a vague errand about needing stamps. She watched Mr. Henderson sort mail with his usual precise movements, but now she noticed the faint tremor in his weathered hands, the slight slump of shoulders that seemed to carry more than just the weight of mailbags. There was a profound weariness in his eyes that she had never truly seen before. Hidden beneath the polite veneer of daily interaction, "Mr. Henderson," she began gently, "I hope you don't mind me saying, but you seem to be carrying quite a burden lately." He paused, a letter halfway to its slot, and looked at her with surprise flickering across his composed features. For a moment, his careful facade wavered, and she glimpsed the raw grief he had been holding alone for so long. They talked quietly as the afternoon light slanted through the small windows, and for the first time since his wife's death, he spoke not in platitudes, but with aching honesty about the loneliness that had become his constant companion. Mrs. Cordelia simply listened, offering not solutions, but the profound comfort of being truly seen. She understood then that Luna's drawings were not childish scribbles, but blueprints of the human heart, revealing the invisible landscape of emotions that shaped their community. Luna didn't just see the buildings. She perceived the feelings that lived within them, the currents that flowed beneath the surface of polite smiles and busy routines. As autumn deepened, Luna's maps continued to reveal hidden truths with gentle accuracy. A streak of vibrant yellow across the fisherman's cottage predicted an unexpected stroke of good fortune. A tangle of grey lines over the old bakery hinted at a quiet conflict that was eventually resolved through patient conversation. Mrs. Cordelia, without ever revealing Luna's secret, found herself becoming a more attuned observer of her community, offering a kind word or listening ear wherever Luna's drawing suggested it was most needed. Luna herself remained largely unaware of the profound impact her cartography had on the adult world. For her, mapping emotions was as natural as breathing, simply how she understood the complex, often unspoken landscape of human connection. She was beginning to sense that her presence could influence these currents, not through conscious effort, but by being herself, a steady point of calm that helped others find their way to clearer waters. During recess, upset children would gravitate toward wherever she was playing, finding comfort in her quiet presence even when she said nothing at all. She learned to leave small drawings tucked in unexpected places, a tiny lighthouse sketched on a bookmark, a gentle wave drawn on the corner of someone's slate, small beacons of hope that reminded people they were not alone in navigating the mysterious tides of being human. Old Tobias, when she showed him her latest maps during their afternoon visits, would nod with deep understanding. "How you're charting the currents that matter most, little navigator," he would say, his weathered hands steady on his teacup. "Not just of the sea, but of the heart. That's the most important navigation there is." Luna was learning to read the infinite madness, that beautiful, overwhelming recognition that everything was connected, that love and pain and joy flowed between all living things like an endless, invisible ocean. In her blue notebook, she was creating a chart for waters that had never been mapped before, preparing for a calling that would ask her to be both observer and gentle guide in the eternal dance of hearts seeking connection, comfort, and the quiet assurance that even in their deepest currents, they were never truly alone. The blue notebook had taught Luna to see the invisible currents that flowed between hearts, but the weeks that followed her 8th birthday taught her something far more profound. She could do more than simply chart these mysterious waters. Like a small boat naturally finding the deepest channel, she began to discover that her presence could gently guide the emotional tides she had been mapping with such careful attention. This revelation came not as a sudden flash of understanding, but as gradually as dawn breaking over the harbor, so gentle at first that she barely noticed the shift from observation to influence. It began with Marcus, the boy whose worried eyes had appeared in her drawing surrounded by storm clouds of deep purple and gray. His parents' hushed arguments had been growing more frequent, and Luna could see how the tension followed him to school like a shadow that wouldn't lift, settling over his desk and making even simple arithmetic feel overwhelming. One particularly blustery afternoon, when the wind rattled the schoolhouse windows, and the children's energy matched the restless weather outside, Marcus sat alone at the far end of the lunch table. He picked at his sandwich with the distracted movements of someone whose mind was elsewhere, lost in echoes of harsh words that had filled his house the night before. The usual cheerful chatter of his classmates seemed to amplify his isolation, creating an invisible barrier between him and the simple joy that surrounded him. Luna found herself drawn to his table not by conscious decision, but by the same gentle pull that had always guided her movements through the world. She settled beside him without invitation, her own lunch momentarily forgotten, as she sensed the storm that raged beneath his quiet exterior. She didn't offer advice or empty reassurances. Somehow she understood that words would only bounce off the wall of worry he had built around himself. Instead, she simply sat with him in comfortable silence, her presence creating a small pocket of calm in the noisy cafeteria. She began eating her own sandwich with unhurried movements, occasionally glancing out the window at the boats bobbing in the harbor, her breathing finding a steady rhythm that seemed to invite his own to slow and deepen. As minutes passed, Luna felt something shifting between them, not dramatic or sudden, but as gentle as the tide changing direction. The tight knot of anxiety in Marcus's chest began to loosen, his shoulders relaxing as if someone had quietly lifted a heavy pack from his back. His breathing grew deeper, and the storm clouds that seemed to hover perpetually around his eyes gradually began to clear. He didn't understand how it happened, only that when Luna was near, the sharp edges of his worry seemed to soften, allowing him to find a calm center he hadn't known was there. By the time they returned to their afternoon lessons, he was humming quietly under his breath, and Luna noticed that the dark purple she had drawn over his desk in her notebook seemed somehow lighter, touched by unexpected rays of gentle yellow. This discovery filled Luna with both wonder and a growing sense of responsibility. She understood instinctively that she wasn't performing magic in any flashy sense. She couldn't wave her hand and make sadness disappear or conjure joy from nothing. But her presence seemed to create space for people to find their own way to calmer waters, like a harbor pilot who guides ships through treacherous passages not by controlling the sea but by knowing its patterns and offering steady guidance through the narrow channels. The other children began seeking her out during recess without quite understanding why. Jenny, who struggled with shyness that made speaking in class feel impossible, would find herself gravitating toward wherever Luna was playing, and somehow the words would come more easily. David, whose quick temper often got him into trouble with both teachers and classmates, discovered that Luna's quiet company helped him pause before reacting, finding patience he hadn't known he possessed. They didn't speak of these changes directly. Children rarely do, but Luna could see the shifts in her emotional maps. The way angry red spirals softened to manageable orange. The way isolated grey pools connected to streams of gentle yellow. It was during one of her afternoon visits with Tobias that Luna began to understand her gift more clearly. The lighthouse keeper poured his tea with hands that had grown steadier since her visits began, and settled into his familiar chair with the contentment of someone who had found unexpected companionship in his solitary calling. "There's a job in some ports," he said thoughtfully, warming his weathered palms around his teacup, "called a harbor pilot. The big ships can cross oceans just fine on their own. But when they come close to shore, when they reach the tricky bits with hidden rocks and shifting channels, they take someone on board who knows the local waters. The pilot doesn't take over the ship forever, mind you. Just for the narrow passages, just long enough to steer by the shape of the bottom that only experience can teach you to see." He didn't say her name, didn't draw obvious parallels, but Luna understood the picture, as if she had always carried it within her. She was learning to be a pilot for hearts navigating the treacherous passages of human emotion, offering not solutions, but presence. Not control, but gentle guidance through the narrow places where people most needed steady companionship. Mrs. Cordelia watched these transformations with growing amazement and deep respect. She had taught long enough to recognize the rare child who possessed unusual gifts, but Luna's abilities went beyond academic brilliance or artistic talent into territory that felt both sacred and profoundly healing. During one particularly difficult afternoon, when the entire class seemed restless and out of sorts, she watched Luna move quietly from desk to desk during free reading time, not speaking but simply being present. Gradually the room settled into peaceful focus, as if Luna were a tuning fork that helped everyone find their proper note in the complex symphony of childhood. "How do you do it?" Mrs. Cordelia asked one afternoon as they walked together through the village, Luna's blue notebook tucked safely under her arm. Luna considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "I don't really do anything," she said finally, her voice carrying the simple wisdom that sometimes emerges from the mouths of children. "I just sit with people until they remember they're okay. Sometimes they forget, but it's always there underneath the worry. Like the lighthouse beam is always there even when fog makes it hard to see." This explanation contained depths that Mrs. Cordelia found herself pondering long into the evening. Luna wasn't healing people in any conventional sense. She was helping them reconnect with their own capacity for peace, their own inner lighthouse that could guide them through emotional storms. It was as if her presence reminded others of their own strength, their own ability to find calm within chaos. At home, Eleanor and Jacques began to notice similar effects. Luna would set the table with a care that made ordinary plates feel ceremonial, humming softly as she aligned each fork and napkin with gentle precision. Jacques, who had begun venturing out on uncertain weather days with renewed confidence, found himself speaking aloud the worries he used to lock behind his teeth. He didn't always expect answers from his young daughter, but somehow saying things in Luna's presence made room for better thoughts to arrive, clearer plans to emerge from the fog of anxiety. As autumn deepened and the lighthouse beam swept through earlier darkness, Luna began to understand that her gift came with responsibilities as well as wonder. She was learning to be a steady point of reference in a world of shifting feelings, a gentle anchor that helped others find their way back to their own inner harbor. Like Tobias with his faithful beacon, she was discovering that her role was not to chase after those in distress, but to stand steady and let her light be seen by those who needed guidance. In her blue notebook that night, Luna drew a new kind of map, one that showed not just where the emotional currents flowed, but the gentle channels she was learning to help others navigate. For the first time, she included herself in the drawing, not as a separate figure, but as soft pathways that connected all the other territories, bridges made of understanding that helped hearts find their way to each other, across the vast, mysterious ocean of human connection. She was beginning to comprehend her place in what the islanders called the infinite madness, that beautiful, overwhelming recognition that everything was connected, that love and pain and joy flowed between all living things like an endless tide. Her gift wasn't to control these currents, but to help others navigate them with grace, to be a pilot light that burned steady and small, ready to kindle larger flames whenever hearts needed, warmth to find their way safely home to themselves, understanding that she could guide emotional currents like a harbor pilot steering ships through treacherous waters. Brought both wonder and weight to Luna's 9th birthday, which arrived quietly with a small cake Eleanor baked after supper and candles that flickered like tiny lighthouse beams in the cottage kitchen. As autumn deepened into winter's first whispers, the rhythm between her home and the lighthouse cottage had become a well-worn path of belonging, each step carrying her deeper into an apprenticeship that felt both chosen and inevitable. Tobias, now moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had served faithfully for 7 decades, began sharing not just stories, but the sacred rituals of lighthouse keeping. One grey afternoon, as fog wrapped the island like a gentle blanket, he presented Luna with a small cloth roll that held a soft brush, a lint-free cloth, and a tiny bottle of oil that caught the lamplight like liquid amber. "Every keeper needs proper tools," he said, his weathered eyes warm with a pride that surprised them both. "And every tool needs care, just like the light itself." This marked the beginning of Luna's formal education in the ancient art of tending beacons, though neither of them spoke of it in such grand terms. Instead, Tobias taught her through patient demonstration, his gnarled hands guiding her small fingers as they learned the gentle circular motion required to polish the great Fresnel lens until it gleamed with liquid brilliance. Each stroke was a meditation, a silent instruction in the importance of clarity that went far beyond mere glass and brass. "The flame wants to be seen," he told her, as they worked shoulder to shoulder in the lamproom, afternoon light slanting through windows that framed the endless conversation between sea and sky. "Your job is to keep the way clear without stepping into the light yourself. It's not about being the brightest thing in the room. It's about being faithful to what you've been asked to tend." Luna absorbed these lessons with the same quiet intensity she brought to everything she loved, discovering unexpected joy in the small rituals of maintenance. There was deep satisfaction in trimming a wick to a clean edge, in the patient rhythm of the brush over brass fittings, in watching surfaces return to their honest shine. Tobias showed her how dust could bloom into trouble if it found the wrong place to settle, how a single thumbprint on glass could bend light into soft confusion. That might mean the difference between safe passage and disaster for some distant ship. The clockwork mechanism that turned the great lens became her favorite mystery to explore, its symphony of cogs and weights requiring regular attention, and the kind of patient listening that reminded Luna of her work with human hearts. "There's a right pace for everything," Tobias explained, placing her small hands on the winding crank so she could feel the honest resistance of metal and spring. "Too fast and you wear it down before its time. Too slow and it fails its purpose. Listen for the pace that feels like breathing." As winter settled over the island, with its familiar rhythm of shortened days and lengthened evenings, Luna discovered that her gift came with boundaries she needed to learn to respect. The deeper troubles that surfaced during the dark months, Mrs. Patterson's persistent sadness that seemed to deepen with each grey day, young Timothy's nightmares that left him too frightened to sleep, called to her with an urgency that felt both compelling and dangerous. It was during one particularly intense afternoon at the grocery store, where she had tried to absorb too much of Mrs. Patterson's heavy sorrow, that Luna learned her most crucial lesson. She returned home pale and shaking, her own light dimmed by carrying burdens that weren't hers to bear. Tobias, when he heard what had happened, wrapped her in a warm blanket and shared wisdom that would anchor her for years to come. "Even a lighthouse needs maintenance," he said gently, his voice carrying the patience of someone who had learned hard lessons about sustainable service. "The lens must be cleaned, the mechanism oiled, the lamp trimmed and tended. If the keeper neglects the lighthouse itself in eagerness to help every ship, soon there will be no light at all. You can't pour from an empty vessel, little navigator." This understanding transformed Luna's approach to her gift, helping her recognize the difference between offering her presence as a steady beacon and trying to absorb others' pain as if she could carry it for them. She learned to trust that her simple presence was often enough, that she didn't need to solve every problem or heal every hurt. Sometimes the greatest gift she could offer was simply sitting quietly with someone while they found their own way through difficult feelings, being a witness to their struggle without trying to take the struggle away. Mrs. Cordelia, who had been watching Luna's development with both fascination and concern, helped her recognize the physical sensations that warned when she was giving too much of herself, the slight dizziness that preceded emotional exhaustion, the way her own feelings became muddied when she tried to carry too much of others' emotional weight. "Your gift is like a well," she explained during one of their afternoon walks through the village. "It has great depth, but it also has limits. Draw from it wisely and it will never run." Dry, the first serious storm of the season, arrived one December evening with the kind of sudden intensity that was not truly sudden if you had been listening to the island's subtle warnings all week. The barometer's needle had been making thoughtful dips, the gulls had been flying lower and quieter, and the very air had taken on that metallic taste that spoke of weather gathering its strength. Beyond the horizon, Luna found herself at the lighthouse cottage, as the wind began to sing its rising song around the tower. Her cloth roll and blue notebook tucked safely under her arm like talismans against the approaching darkness. Together, she and Tobias climbed the spiral stairs, the lighthouse itself humming its low, familiar tune, as the storm announced its presence with increasing authority. In the lamp room, they worked with the kind of quiet efficiency that comes from shared purpose and mutual trust. Tobias lit the auxiliary lanterns, while Luna checked each window latch in turn, her palms flat against the frames like blessings at every junction of wood and weather. When the great beam began its sweep across waters that were already showing whitecaps, she imagined it touching each roof in the village like a goodnight kiss, each boat in the harbor like a reassuring hand on a shoulder. The storm tested not just the lighthouse's physical integrity, but Luna's growing understanding of her own calling. As wind howled around the tower and rain drummed against the windows with increasing intensity, she felt the collective anxiety of the island community like a tide pulling at her consciousness. The urge to somehow absorb all that worry, to carry it so others wouldn't have to, rose in her chest like a familiar temptation, but she remembered Tobias's words about sustainable service, about the lighthouse that stands steady rather than chasing after every ship in distress. Instead of trying to drain the community's fear, she simply held her own center, becoming a small point of calm that others could sense even from a distance. Her presence in the lighthouse that night was like a tuning fork, helping the entire island find its proper note in the complex symphony of weathering storms together. When the worst gusts had passed and the rain softened to thoughtful tapping against the glass, Tobias poured tea from the small kettle he kept near the stove. They drank in companionable silence, steam ghosting the lamproom with the gentlest fog of all, while the beam continued its patient sweep across waters that were already beginning to calm. Luna leaned her forehead against the cool glass, far enough to see clearly, close enough to feel connected, and watched the light cut through the darkness like a ribbon of unwavering promise. Somewhere out there a boat would turn toward home because the light told the truth about the shore. Somewhere in the village, a worried mind would unclench because the beam kept its faithful rhythm through the storm. She understood now that her apprenticeship was about more than learning to clean lenses and wind clockwork. She was learning to be a lighthouse keeper of the heart, tending not a physical beacon, but an inner light that could guide others through the mysterious passages of human emotion. Her blue notebook, when she opened it later that night, filled with new kinds of maps that showed not just where emotional currents flowed, but the safe channels she was learning to help others navigate, the harbors where weary hearts could find rest and renewal. As she closed her eyes and let her familiar hum find its rhythm with the lighthouse's own deep song, Luna felt herself settling into her calling with the same natural certainty that guided the tides. The work was simple in its depth. Keep the light clear, mind the flame, hold steady when everything else was moving. Outside, the wind gathered itself for whatever weather might come next. Inside, two keepers, one old, one young, kept company with a light that knew how to speak in all languages, including the most important one of all, the wordless assurance that even in the darkest storms, someone is always watching, always tending the beacon that calls lost souls safely home. The understanding that she could guide emotional currents, like a harbor pilot steering ships through treacherous waters, had settled into Luna's bones. By the time winter arrived with unusual ferocity, bringing not just one storm, but a relentless succession of them that seemed determined to test every lesson she had learned about the delicate balance between service and self-preservation. The ferry ceased its faithful crossings, supply boats remained anchored in distant harbors, and the island found itself wrapped in a cocoon of isolation that grew tighter with each passing day. What began as familiar winter inconvenience gradually transformed into something more serious. As the week stretched on without relief, the small grocery store showed gaps on its shelves like missing teeth. Families began rationing coffee and flour with the careful attention usually reserved for precious things, and conversations carried undertones of worry that hadn't been there before. Luna felt the shift in the island's emotional weather as distinctly as she felt the bite of salt air against her cheeks, her blue notebook filling with new patterns of anxiety that seemed to pulse and tangle like living things. At 9 years old, Luna found herself facing her first real test of the boundaries Tobias had taught her to maintain. The collective distress of her community called to her with increasing urgency, each worried face seeming to plead silently for the comfort she had learned to offer. Mrs. Patterson's persistent sadness deepened with concerns about medication running low. Timothy's mother fretted openly about whether their pantry would last until spring. Even the usually cheerful postmaster carried shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent calculating impossible equations. The temptation to somehow absorb all this worry, to carry it so others wouldn't have to, grew stronger each day like a tide that refused to turn. Luna felt herself pulled toward every anxious conversation, every fearful glance toward the empty harbor, where the ferry should have been cutting its familiar wake through grey waters. She began spending longer hours moving through the village, sitting with this person and that, offering her presence wherever distress gathered like storm clouds. But the island's worry, cut off from the mainland and watching supplies dwindle like slow sunsets, began to stack upon itself in ways that overwhelmed even her generous capacity for holding others' pain. Layer upon layer of collective anxiety pressed against her consciousness, until her own inner light began to flicker like a candle in a draught. Her familiar humming grew thin and strained. Her sleep became restless with dreams that weren't her own, and the shadows under her eyes began to mirror those she saw in every mirror of worry around her. It was during the worst storm of the season, when wind howled around the lighthouse, with a voice that seemed to carry the island's accumulated fears, that Luna finally reached her breaking point. She had spent the day moving from house to house, trying to offer comfort to everyone who needed it, absorbing worry after worry, until her own emotional compass spun wildly without finding true north. When she finally arrived at the lighthouse cottage, her legs trembling with exhaustion, she was too young to understand. Tobias took one look at her pale face and guided her gently to his familiar chair. "Even lighthouses need maintenance," he said quietly, wrapping her in the wool blanket that had warmed countless keepers through countless storms. His weathered hands prepared tea with movements that seemed to carry decades of patient wisdom, and when he spoke again, his voice held the gentle authority of someone who had learned hard lessons about sustainable service. "The lens must be cleaned, the mechanism oiled, the flame tended and trimmed. If the keeper neglects the lighthouse itself in eagerness to help every ship, soon there will be no light at all." He taught her a technique he had never shared before, a practice he called the keeper's rhythm. "Watch the beam," he said, and together they stood before the great lens as it made its eternal rotation. "Breathe in when the light faces the village, breathe out when it turns toward the sea. Let what isn't yours pass by like ships you acknowledge, but do not board. Your job is not to carry their cargo, but to help them navigate their own way through the narrow passages." They practiced this together for 10 slow rotations, Luna counting softly while Tobias matched her cadence, until the frantic wires in her chest began to loosen and her natural rhythm returned. She felt her own light gathering itself back from the scattered places where she had tried to be everything to everyone, collecting in her center like water finding its proper level. The lesson transformed not just her understanding but her practice. Over the following days, as the storm continued its relentless assault on the island's patience, Luna learned to help one room at a time, to sit for measured intervals before moving on, trusting that the ember of peace she offered could hold itself without her constant tending. She discovered that when she maintained her own boundaries, her presence became more powerful rather than less, like a lighthouse beam that cuts through fog precisely because it doesn't scatter itself in all directions. When she sat with Mrs. Patterson now, she listened with full attention, but didn't try to absorb the older woman's loneliness. Instead, she asked gentle questions that helped Mrs. Patterson find her own windows of light within the dark rooms of her worry. With the children, she drew maps in her notebook that showed not just where anxiety lived, but the bridges of kindness they could build to help each other, turning their restless energy toward concrete acts of care that took less time than fretting and filled the same space more sweetly. The storm finally exhausted itself as all storms do, discovering its own edges and retreating with the grudging respect that weather shows for its own limits. When the first supply boat in weeks managed to reach the harbor, the island community had learned something valuable about resilience that went beyond mere endurance. They had discovered they could weather emotional storms as well as physical ones, supporting each other through genuine presence, rather than frantic attempts to eliminate every discomfort. Luna's blue notebook, when she opened it after the crisis had passed, showed maps where chaotic tangles had given way to steadier currents, patterns that spoke of a community that had found its sea legs in rough weather. She had learned her most crucial lesson about the infinite madness. That beautiful recognition of universal connection didn't require her to carry the world's pain, but simply to be a faithful keeper of whatever light had been entrusted to her care. As she sat on the lighthouse steps that first clear evening, watching the beam sweep across waters that sparkled with renewed promise, Luna understood that true service came not from taking on others' burdens, but from maintaining her own light so clearly that others could find their way to their own sources of strength. She was becoming not just a lighthouse keeper, but a teacher of navigation, showing others how to tend their own flames while remaining connected to the vast, gentle ocean of compassion that flowed between all hearts, seeking their way safely home. The lessons learned during the winter storms had settled into Luna's understanding like sediment, finding its proper depth, and as spring arrived with its familiar promise of renewal, another kind of passage awaited her. At 10 years old, she had absorbed everything the island's small schoolhouse could offer, and Mrs. Cordelia approached Elena and Jacques one evening with the gentle suggestion that Luna's education required broader horizons than their beloved island could provide. The conversation unfolded around the cottage table with the careful tenderness reserved for important transitions. Eleanor folded Luna's outgrown clothes, while Jacques sketched plans for reinforcing the fishing boat's hull, and Mrs. Cordelia spoke quietly about the mainland high school that welcomed island children, the ferry that would carry Luna across the channel each morning like a bridge between worlds. The decision felt both inevitable and momentous, like watching the tide turn from one familiar rhythm to another. Tobias, when he learned of the plan during one of their afternoon visits, disappeared into the lighthouse cottage and returned with a small brass compass that caught the lamplight like captured starshine. Its face was worn smooth by decades of faithful service, and when he placed it in Luna's palm, the weight felt both substantial and comforting. "For the crossings," he said, his weathered voice carrying the particular gentleness he reserved for important gifts. "When the fog is thick and you can't see either shore, it helps to have a small truth in your pocket. This one always points toward what matters most." The first morning ferry ride became Luna's introduction to the art of existing between worlds. She stood at the bow with the compass warm in her palm and her blue notebook tucked safely under her arm, watching the island shrink behind her while the mainland grew larger ahead. The 20-minute journey felt like a daily meditation, a sacred transition that required its own kind of attention. She practiced the keeper's rhythm Tobias had taught her, breathing in when the bow pointed toward new horizons, breathing out when the wake connected her to familiar shores. The mainland high school sprawled across several buildings like a small city, housing more students than Luna had ever imagined gathering in one place. The hallways buzzed with conversations that layered upon each other like competing radio stations, creating emotional currents far more complex than anything she had navigated in the island's gentle eddies. Here, teenage anxiety mixed with academic pressure, social hierarchies created invisible barriers between groups, and the particular loneliness of feeling different pressed against her consciousness, like weather fronts colliding. Luna discovered that her gift, which had always felt as natural as breathing in the island's intimate community, required careful calibration in this larger context. The emotional maps she tried to draw in her notebook became tangled webs that reflected her own confusion more than any useful navigation tool. The sheer volume of unspoken feelings, worry about grades, fear of rejection, the deep ache of not belonging, threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained boundaries. It was in the school library that Luna found her anchor. Libraries, she discovered, possessed their own kind of lighthouse energy, offering sanctuary to anyone seeking refuge from the storms of daily life. The large windows let in patient light, the shelves created natural barriers against noise. The librarian, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, moved through the space with the unhurried grace of someone who understood that healing often required nothing more than a quiet place to breathe. Luna claimed a corner table near the poetry section, spreading her notebook and pencils like tools for a gentle excavation of understanding. It was there, during her second week, that she noticed him, a boy about her age with dark hair that fell across thoughtful eyes, writing in a composition notebook, with the focused intensity of someone translating inner experience into words. Something about his stillness in the midst of the library's quiet bustle drew her attention, not because he seemed troubled, but because he seemed to have found his own way of maintaining center in chaos. When their eyes met across the reading tables, Luna felt a recognition that had nothing to do with previous acquaintance, and everything to do with recognizing a kindred spirit. This was Sage, she learned when he quietly introduced himself, a boy known throughout the school for leaving small poems tucked into library books like gifts for whoever might need them. Their friendship developed with the organic pace of understanding that needs no rushing. During lunch periods, they would sit together in their corner of the library, Sage sharing poems that captured feelings most people couldn't even name, Luna sketching the emotional currents that flowed through their small sanctuary. He helped her articulate what she had always felt, but never quite found words for, that emotions were not weaknesses to be overcome, but information to be honored, currents that carried important messages if you learned to read them properly. "It's like you see the world's weather," Sage said one afternoon, his pen tracing delicate patterns in the margins of his notebook. "Not just the rain and sunshine everyone notices, but the pressure changes, the way the air moves differently before storms, the particular quality of light that means something beautiful is coming." Together, they began creating something neither could have managed alone. Their corner table became an unofficial sanctuary where overwhelmed classmates could discover a moment of peace, not through any announced program, but simply by encountering the kind of presence that invited deeper breathing. Luna would sit with her blue notebook, mapping the gentle currents that seemed to flow more smoothly in their quiet space, while Sage wrote poems that captured the particular loneliness of being young and feeling everything too deeply. As autumn deepened and the ferry rides became her daily rhythm between two worlds, Luna began to understand that her calling was expanding beyond the island's familiar shores. The lighthouse beam that had guided her childhood still swept its faithful path across the waters each night, but now it seemed to be pointing toward a larger understanding of what it meant to be a keeper of light in a world that often felt dark and chaotic. Her blue notebook, filled with new kinds of maps, ones that showed not just individual, emotional currents but the larger patterns that connected. Teenage anxiety to deeper questions about belonging and purpose. She was learning to read the infinite madness on a broader scale, discovering that the same principles that guided her work on the island could create healing spaces anywhere. Hearts gathered seeking connection, comfort, and the quiet assurance that even in their deepest storms, they were never truly alone. The compass in her pocket pointed steadily toward what mattered most, the understanding that sensitivity was not a burden, but a form of intelligence the world desperately needed, and that even the smallest lights, when tended with faithful care, could guide others safely through the mysterious passages of being human. The friendship between Luna and Sage deepened with the unhurried patience of tides finding their rhythm, each conversation adding another layer to their understanding of how hearts could work together to create something larger than either could manage alone. As winter settled over the mainland, with its particular quality of grey light filtered through urban air, their corner of the library began to transform from a simple refuge into something that felt almost sacred, a small harbor where overwhelmed souls could find the kind of peace that asked for nothing in return. It began with small offerings that seemed to appear naturally, like gifts the space itself was learning to give. Sage arrived one morning with a tiny fern in a chipped blue pot, its delicate fronds catching the window light as he tucked it beneath their usual table. "Every sanctuary needs something living," he said simply, and Luna understood that he was speaking not just about plants, but about the way their presence had begun to breathe life into this corner of the world. Luna responded by bringing a mason jar filled with sea glass she had collected during years of island wanderings, each piece worn smooth by countless tides until it held light like captured starshine. She arranged the pieces by color, green for breathing deeply, pale amber for remembering kindness, and one precious cobalt shard that seemed to pulse with its own gentle energy. "For wishes that don't need to be spoken aloud," she explained, and Sage nodded with the immediate recognition that comes when someone understands the language you've been speaking all your life. Ms. Vale, the librarian, watched these transformations with the quiet attention of someone who had spent decades recognizing when something important was taking root. Without announcement or fanfare, she began setting out 2 mugs and a small electric kettle on the back counter, as if she had always known that healing work required warm drinks and the kind of hospitality that felt like blessing. She rearranged the poetry shelves to create a more natural barrier around their corner, a reconfiguration that looked like ordinary library maintenance, but felt like the careful tending of something precious. Their table learned the weight of other people's stories, the particular way elbows rested when someone had finally found a place to set down burdens they had been carrying alone. Luna discovered that it took exactly 3 deep breaths for most people to find the slower rhythm of their corner, while Sage noticed how shoulders dropped the moment someone's fingers touched the smooth sea glass, as if the stones themselves carried some ancient memory of calm. One grey afternoon, when the ferry had struggled through choppy waters, and Luna arrived already feeling winter's accumulated weight, she found a boy named Marcus hovering at the end of their aisle. He clutched index cards for a presentation that had been stealing his sleep for weeks, his anxiety bright enough that Luna could feel it like heat from across the room. The old impulse to somehow absorb his worry rose in her chest, but she remembered Tobias's lessons about sustainable service and looked up with an invitation instead of rescue. "You can sit here without talking," she said gently, her voice carrying the same patient tone she used when polishing lighthouse lenses. "Nothing bad will happen to your voice. It can rest and still be yours." Sage, who understood the precise weight that words could carry, slid a torn piece of paper toward Marcus. On it he had written 2 lines that felt like a hand reaching through darkness. "Your breath is a small boat. It knows the way back and doesn't need to hurry." Marcus stared at the words, blinked slowly, and then began breathing in a new pattern, like someone remembering a half-forgotten lullaby. When he finally stood to leave for class, he took the cobalt shard from the jar and pressed it against his palm. "I'll return the wish," he whispered, and Luna smiled because some wishes preferred to travel rather than stay in one place. The sanctuary grew through these small exchanges, each interaction creating ripples that touched other lives in ways they could observe but never fully track. A girl whose parents were dividing their shared life into separate houses would take the green glass and trace its smooth edges while telling no one anything. But later she would water the fern with the kind of careful attention that spoke of gratitude, too deep for words. A teacher struggling with persistent headaches would sit at the very edge of their table and watch sunlight crawl across booksy spines until the tension behind her eyes eased, enough to finish the day with patience rather than irritation. Luna began to understand that she and Sage were learning to speak a language that had no words, the dialect of presence that communicated through shared silence, through the way they moved through their space with unhurried attention, through the simple act of being consistently available without demanding anything in return. Her blue notebook filled with new kinds of maps that showed not just individual emotional currents, but the gentle pathways their corner was creating, channels that helped isolated feelings flow toward connection and understanding. "It's like you see the world's weather," Sage said one afternoon, his pen tracing delicate patterns in the margins of his composition book. "Not just the rain and sunshine everyone notices, but the pressure changes. The way the air moves differently before storms, the particular quality of light that means something beautiful is coming." This recognition sparked something neither had planned, but both had been unconsciously preparing for. They began leaving small gifts throughout the school, not grand gestures that would draw attention, but tiny acts of anonymous kindness that seemed to appear exactly when someone needed them most. Sage would slip carefully chosen poems into lockers where he had noticed someone struggling, while Luna sketched small lighthouses on bookmarks and tucked them into library books that dealt with difficult subjects. The impact rippled through the school in ways that felt both mysterious and completely natural. Students who had been eating lunch alone began joining others at regular tables. A boy known for his quick temper started taking longer pauses before reacting, as if he had found some internal compass that helped him navigate toward better responses. The library itself developed a reputation as a place where homework felt less overwhelming, and social anxiety seemed more manageable, though no one could quite explain why. During her evening ferry rides home, Luna would stand at the bow with Tobias's compass warm in her palm and watch the lighthouse beam begin its nightly sweep across darkening waters. The rhythm connected her 2 worlds, the island that had taught her the foundational skills of emotional navigation, and the mainland school that was showing her how those skills could create healing in larger, more complex environments. her notebook filled with maps that showed not just individual hearts finding their way to calmer waters, but entire communities learning to support each other through the inevitable storms of being human. One evening, as she climbed the lighthouse stairs for her regular visit with Tobias, Luna noticed that his movements had grown more deliberate, his breathing slightly heavier on the spiral climb that had been automatic for decades. He still tended the light with steady hands, still shared his quiet wisdom over cups of tea that steamed like small prayers in the lamp room. But something in his eyes spoke of distances he was beginning to measure differently. "The work is changing," he said, as they watched the beam cut through early winter darkness, his weathered voice carrying the particular gentleness that comes with understanding transitions, growing beyond what one keeper can tend alone. That's not failure, that's success. Light that spreads is light that's doing what it was meant to do. Luna felt the compass in her pocket pulse with its steady magnetic truth, pointing toward what mattered most, the recognition that her calling was expanding beyond the island's familiar shores, beyond even the mainland school's library corner, towards something larger and more complex than she had ever imagined. The infinite madness, that beautiful, overwhelming recognition that everything was connected, was revealing itself not as a burden to be carried alone, but as a practical tool for creating communities where people could support each other through the mysterious passages of being human. As she closed her eyes and let her familiar hum find its rhythm with the lighthouse's own deep song, Luna understood that she was being prepared for a responsibility that would ask her to be both student and teacher, both keeper and guide, helping others learn to tend their own lights while remaining connected to the vast, gentle ocean of compassion that flowed between all hearts seeking their way safely home to themselves. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal sweep, carrying its message across the dark waters. You are not alone, you are seen, you are loved. And in that patient light, Luna felt herself growing into whatever she was meant to become. One breath at a time, one small act of kindness at a time, one heart at a time, learning to navigate by the light of understanding rather than the harsh glare of judgment, the understanding that her calling was expanding beyond familiar shores had settled into Luna's bones like sediment finding its proper depth. And as her 17th birthday approached, with the quiet inevitability of tides, the changes in Tobias revealed themselves with the same gentle persistence. His movements up the spiral stairs had grown more deliberate over the autumn months, his breathing carrying a new quality of effort that spoke not of weakness, but of a body that had served faithfully for 7 decades and was beginning to ask for different kinds of consideration. Luna noticed these shifts with the keen awareness that had always guided her through the world's invisible currents. During their afternoon visits, she would arrive to find him resting longer in his familiar chair, his gaze fixed on the horizon with a mixture of contentment and something that looked remarkably like preparation. The great lens above them continued its faithful rotation, but she began observing small details that spoke of maintenance deferred, a slight film on the brass fittings, auxiliary lanterns that remained unlit when weather called for extra precaution, the clockwork mechanism carrying an almost imperceptible irregularity that only someone who had learned to listen with her particular attention would notice. It was during one of these visits, as winter light slanted through the lamp-room windows with its characteristic quality of silver patience, that Luna found herself naturally reaching for the polishing cloth without being asked. Tobias watched her work with eyes that held both gratitude and a kind of recognition that went deeper than words, as if he were witnessing the fulfillment of something he had been quietly hoping for, without daring to name it directly. "The light wants to be seen," she said gently, repeating the words he had taught her years ago, and Tobias nodded with the particular satisfaction that comes when a student demonstrates not just technical skill, but true understanding. "Yes," he replied, his weathered voice carrying the tenderness that marked all their most important conversations. "And sometimes the keeper needs help remembering how to tend it properly." This marked the beginning of Luna's deeper apprenticeship, not announced with ceremony, but emerging as naturally as seasons change. She began arriving at the lighthouse cottage earlier each afternoon, her blue notebook and school materials creating a familiar arrangement on the small table, where she could complete her mainland assignments while remaining available for whatever the lighthouse required. The ferry rides that had once been transitions between two worlds became precious intervals for processing the weight of responsibility that was settling around her shoulders like a cloak that had been tailored. For this exact moment, Tobias shared the subtleties. He had never revealed before how to read the particular quality of light. That meant the lens needed attention, how to adjust the clockwork timing to account for seasonal changes, how to maintain the delicate balance between mechanical precision and the mysterious presence that made the lighthouse more than just a navigation aid. But more importantly, he offered the deeper wisdom that had sustained him through decades of solitary service. A lighthouse keeper holds two kinds of vigil, he explained during one of their evening sessions, his weathered hands guiding hers as they adjusted the wick to its optimal height. The practical one that keeps ships from running aground, and the spiritual one that reminds people they're not alone in the darkness. Both matter equally, but the second one is what makes the work sacred rather than just necessary. Luna absorbed these lessons with the same quiet intensity she brought to everything she loved, but now she understood the true scope of what was being entrusted to her care. The lighthouse had always been more than a navigation aid for the island community. It was a symbol of continuity, a daily reminder that someone was keeping watch, that even in the darkest storms, someone maintained the steady presence that called lost souls safely home. As spring approached with its familiar promise of renewal, a gentle crisis arrived not with drama, but with the kind of quiet insistence that characterizes all truly important transitions. Luna arrived at the lighthouse cottage one afternoon to find Mrs. Cordelia's familiar figure at the door, her kind eyes carrying a mixture of concern and the particular calm that comes with accepting necessary changes. Nothing dangerous, Mrs. Cordelia assured her before Luna could voice the worry that had immediately risen in her chest. But Tobias needs rest, and the doctor insists on no climbing for a while. The light will need tending, and we all know there's only one person on this island who's truly ready for that responsibility. That evening, Luna climbed the spiral stairs alone for the first time as the designated keeper on duty. Each step echoed with the years Tobias had made the same ascent, his steady presence a constant through all her childhood and adolescence. In the lamp room, the great Fresnel lens stood waiting, its polished surface reflecting the last vestiges of twilight like a sleeping eye that trusted her to help it wake for another night of faithful service. The silence felt profound, broken only by the rhythmic tick of the clockwork mechanism, a sound that usually brought comfort, but now carried the weight of genuine responsibility. Luna remembered Tobias's words about lighthouses, not chasing after ships in distress, but standing steady and letting their light be seen by those who needed guidance. She had learned the practical skills over years of patient apprenticeship, but now, alone in the lamp room, she understood that the true work of the keeper went far beyond mechanics. With hands that felt both small and entirely capable, Luna began the evening ritual that would now be hers to perform. She lit the lamp, her movements precise and deliberate, watching the flame catch and bloom into steady radiance. She wound the clockwork mechanism, feeling the familiar resistance of the springs, listening for the pace that felt like breathing. Then, with the soft cloth that had become as familiar as her own blue notebook, she began polishing the lens, each circular motion a meditation, each stroke a silent prayer for clarity and safe passage. As the beam began its faithful sweep across the darkening waters, Luna stood beside it and felt the rhythm of its rotation in her own body. The lighthouse, she understood with crystalline clarity, was more than just a navigation aid for ships. It was a beacon of emotional stability for the entire island community, its unwavering light a promise that even when storms raged or supplies dwindled or worry pressed in from all directions, there was always a dependable point of reference, a steady presence that held the center while everything else moved. She thought of Mrs. Patterson, who found comfort in the predictable sweep of light across her bedroom window each night. She thought of the fishermen, her father among them, who measured their journeys by its distant glow. She thought of the children who knew its steady presence as a constant against the vast unknown sea. The lighthouse, she realized, was a silent testament to endurance, a symbol of hope that transcended mere functionality and entered the realm of the sacred. Her entire life, it seemed, had been preparation for this moment. Her mysterious birth during the one night Tobias forgot to dream Her childhood ability to sense and gently guide emotional currents, her blue notebook filled with maps of the heart's hidden territories, her friendship with Sage that helped her articulate the unspoken, her years of creating sanctuaries in chaotic environments, all of it had been leading her to this quiet, profound responsibility. During her ferry rides to the mainland school the following weeks, Luna carried this new understanding like a compass that pointed not just north, but toward a calling that felt both chosen and inevitable. In the library sanctuary she and Sage had created, their corner table continued to offer refuge to overwhelmed souls. But now Luna brought to that work the deeper wisdom of someone who had learned to tend light, not just for individuals, but for entire communities. "You're different," Sage observed one afternoon, his pen pausing over the poem he was writing. "Not changed exactly, but more yourself than before, if that makes sense." Luna smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. She was learning to inhabit her gifts with the confidence of someone who had found her proper place in the world's complex symphony. The blue notebook that had once held her childhood maps of emotional currents now contained detailed schedules for lighthouse maintenance, weather observations, and the kind of practical notes that kept complex systems functioning smoothly. But it also held something new, drawings that showed not just individual hearts finding their way to calmer waters, but entire communities learning to navigate by the light of understanding rather than the harsh glare of judgment. As winter gave way to spring and Luna settled into the rhythm of her dual responsibilities, she discovered that tending the lighthouse had deepened rather than complicated her work at the mainland school. The patience required for maintaining mechanical precision, the vigilance needed to read weather patterns, the steady presence demanded by the work of keeping light, all of these qualities enhanced her ability to create healing spaces wherever hearts gathered seeking connection and comfort. One particularly clear night, as she stood in the lamp room watching the beam cut through darkness with its eternal promise, Luna felt herself fully accepting the role that had been waiting for her since birth. She was not replacing Tobias, but continuing a sentence that had started long before her and would extend long after. An ancient story told in a new voice with the same faithful ending. The lighthouse beam swept across the dark waters, carrying its message to anyone who needed to hear it. You are not alone, you are seen, you are loved. And in that patient light, Luna understood that she had become what she was always meant to be, a keeper, not just of a physical beacon, but of the deeper light that helps hearts navigate the mysterious passages of being human, one gentle revolution at a time, one steady breath at a time, one small act of faithful service at a time. Outside, the sea continued its eternal conversation with the shore. Inside, the newest lighthouse keeper tended her flame with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her place in the infinite madness. That beautiful, overwhelming recognition that everything was connected, that love and compassion flowed between all living things like an endless tide, and that even the smallest lights, when tended with faithful care, could guide entire communities safely through whatever storms might come. The rhythm of tending the lighthouse had woven itself into Luna's very being by the time autumn arrived with its familiar promise of longer nights and deeper contemplation. Each sweep of the beam had become a meditation, each tick of the clockwork a heartbeat that seemed to pulse not just through the mechanism, but through the entire island, connecting her awareness to rhythms she was only beginning to understand. As she moved through her days, balancing the quiet vigilance of the keeper with the bustling demands of mainland high school, something profound was shifting in her perception of the world and her place within it. It began with small recognitions that felt both startling and utterly natural. During her evening vigil in the lamp room, as the great lens made its patient rotations and the beam swept across waters that held the stories of countless journeys, Luna would sometimes feel her awareness expanding beyond the lighthouse walls, not in any mystical sense that would frighten practical minds, but with the same organic extension of perception that had always allowed her to sense when someone needed comfort before they asked for it. She began to feel the island breathing as a living entity, the collective exhale of families settling into evening routines, the gentle inhale of worry being released as children found sleep, the steady heartbeat of a community that had learned to trust in continuity. The lighthouse beam, she understood with growing clarity, was not just cutting through physical darkness, but touching each cottage window like a blessing, each boat in the harbor like a reassuring hand on a shoulder, reminding everyone within its reach that they were held within something larger and more tender than their individual concerns. This awareness brought both wonder and the first glimmering of what the islanders had always called the infinite madness. Luna began to understand that this phrase, whispered with a mixture of awe and respectful distance, was not a warning about something to be feared, but a recognition of something so beautiful it could overwhelm unprepared hearts. It was not madness in any chaotic sense, but what she came to think of as the deepest sanity, a profound recognition of the interconnectedness of all things, the vast web of connection that linked every heart to every other heart, in patterns too beautiful and complex for any single mind to fully comprehend. During one particularly clear night in late summer, when the air held that crystalline quality that made distant stars seem close enough to touch, Luna experienced this truth in its full magnitude. Standing in the lamproom with her palms flat against the cool glass, she felt herself becoming aware of connections that stretched far beyond the island's shores. The lighthouse beam, as it made its eternal sweep across the water, seemed to touch not just local fishing boats, but vessels moving through distant waters, other lighthouses whose keepers were tending their own flames with the same patient devotion. Hearts everywhere that had ever stood in darkness hoping for light. For a moment, that felt both eternal and instantaneous, Luna felt the infinite madness as a living reality. She understood suddenly why most people learn to shut down their awareness of this universal connection, not because they lacked the capacity for deep empathy, but because the sheer magnitude of love and pain and longing that flowed between all living things could easily overwhelm any individual consciousness. It was like trying to contain the ocean in a teacup, to hold the entire sky in cupped palms. But rather than retreating from this awareness, Luna found herself learning to navigate it with the same skills Tobias had taught her for tending the lighthouse itself. She practiced the keeper's rhythm, breathing in when the recognition felt manageable, breathing out when it threatened to become too much, trusting that she didn't need to carry the world's entire emotional weight, but simply tend her own small portion of the vast, interconnected flame. When she shared this understanding with Tobias during one of his afternoon visits, he listened with the quiet satisfaction of a teacher watching a student discover truths that had been waiting for them all along. His weathered hands wrapped around his teacup as he spoke with the gentle authority of someone who had spent decades contemplating these mysteries. Every generation of keepers discovers this eventually, he said. Afternoon light slanting through the cottage windows. The light we tend is never just for the ships we can see. It's connected to every other light that's ever been kindled by someone who understood that darkness is not the enemy. Isolation is. What the islanders call the infinite madness isn't madness at all. It's simply love recognizing itself in all its forms, everywhere it appears. This revelation transformed Luna's work, both at the lighthouse and in the library sanctuary she continued to maintain with Sage during her mainland school days. She no longer felt the frantic urge to heal every hurt or solve every problem, but instead cultivated the deeper wisdom of being a steady presence that helped others remember their own capacity for connection. Her blue notebook began filling with observations about the patterns that linked individual healing to community well-being, the ways that one person finding peace could create ripples that touched dozens of other lives. At school, she and Sage began creating spaces where this understanding could be practiced without being preached. Their library corner became a living testament to the infinite madness, not as overwhelming chaos, but as the recognition that everyone possessed an innate capacity for connection that had simply been covered over by fear and the illusion of separation. When overwhelmed students found their way to their table, Luna would offer a piece of smooth sea glass, while Sage shared a carefully chosen poem, both of them understanding that they weren't providing solutions, but creating space for people to remember their own inherent belonging. The work was simple in its profundity. Keep the light clear, mind the flame, hold steady when everything else was moving. But now Luna understood that this simplicity contained depths that connected her small lighthouse to every other beacon that had ever been, kindled by someone who understood that the antidote to darkness was not the elimination of shadow, but the patient tending of whatever light had been entrusted to their care. As She closed her eyes that night and let her familiar hum find its rhythm with the lighthouse's own deep song. Luna felt herself fully embracing the infinite madness, that beautiful recognition that everything was connected, that love flowed between all living things like an endless tide, and that her role was not to carry this vast ocean, but to be a faithful keeper of whatever small portion of light had been placed in her care, trusting that even the smallest flames, when tended with patient devotion, could help entire communities remember their way home to the tender mystery of being human together beneath an ocean of stars. The understanding of the infinite madness had settled into Luna's consciousness like light finding its proper refraction, and as her 20th birthday approached with the quiet certainty of tides, she began to recognize that her calling was asking for a new kind of expression, the recognition that everything was connected, that love and pain and joy flowed between all living things like an endless, invisible ocean, was no longer something she simply experienced, but something she felt compelled to share, not as doctrine, but as practical wisdom that could help others navigate their own emotional waters with greater skill and gentleness. It began with small requests that arrived like messages in bottles, washing up on the shores of her awareness with gentle insistence. Mrs. Patterson approached her one morning after the ferry docked, her weathered hands clasped with the particular nervousness that accompanies important questions. "My granddaughter is coming to visit from the city," she said, her voice carrying years of watching someone she loved struggle with anxieties that seemed to multiply in urban environments. "She's having such a hard time with everything feeling too much, too loud, too overwhelming. I wondered if you might speak with her about how you managed to stay so calm in the middle of chaos." The conversation that followed, conducted on the lighthouse steps while the afternoon sun painted the harbor in shades of liquid gold, became Luna's first formal lesson in articulating what she had been learning unconsciously for years. She found herself sharing the keeper's rhythm that Tobias had taught her during that winter storm. The practice of breathing in when facing towards stability and breathing out when releasing what wasn't hers to carry. She showed the young woman how to sketch the currents of feeling that moved through her days, not to control them, but to understand their patterns and find the gentle channels that led toward calmer waters. "I don't really do anything," Luna explained, her voice carrying the same patient tone she used when polishing lighthouse lenses. "I just sit with people until they remember they have their own light. Sometimes we forget, especially when everything feels dark and chaotic, but it's always there underneath the worry, like the lighthouse beam is always rotating even when fog makes it hard to see." Word of these conversations began to spread through the island, community with the organic pace of understanding that needs no advertising. Timothy, now a young man grappling with the particular anxiety that comes with not knowing how to fit into a world that feels too sharp and too fast, began joining Luna for her evening lighthouse duties. Marcus, whose worried eyes had appeared in her childhood drawings, sought her out during a difficult period when his parents' old tensions had resurfaced. Sarah, whose homesickness had evolved into a deeper struggle with belonging anywhere, learned to map her emotional geography in a blue notebook of her own. As autumn deepened, and Luna found herself spending more time in these gentle teaching moments, she began to understand that she was offering something different from traditional counseling, a practical spirituality that treated emotional navigation as a learnable skill rather than a mysterious talent. Her approach was grounded in the lighthouse keeper's wisdom. You cannot control the weather, but you can learn to tend your light so clearly that others can find their way through whatever storms arise. The first formal gathering happened almost by accident. Mrs. Cordelia suggested that Luna might speak to a small group at the library about managing overwhelming feelings, and when the evening arrived, more people appeared than anyone had expected. Luna, feeling suddenly aware of the weight of their attention, did what felt most natural. She moved the gathering to the lighthouse cottage, where the familiar rhythm of the beam could provide its own kind of teaching. "We're not here to fix anything," she said, her voice soft but steady, as she placed a smooth piece of sea glass in the center of their circle. "We're here to remember how to be with what is." She guided them through the keeper's rhythm, breathing in as the light faced toward them, breathing out as it turned toward the sea. "Let what isn't yours pass like ships you acknowledge but do not board." They practiced this for 10 revolutions of the light, and Luna watched as shoulders lowered, Breathing deepened, and the room settled into a quieter pulse. When they did speak, it was in small pieces, like tide-smoothed glass. Nothing sharp, everything softened by time and movement. She taught them simple tools, the boundary at the window frame, fingertips resting on wood to feel how the world could be close without entering uninvited, the three-breath anchor that helped them feel their own weight, notice their surroundings and choose what to welcome or release. Tobias, wrapped in his familiar wool sweater, poured tea and passed sandwiches with the humble grace that made learning feel like family rather than instruction. People ate slowly and discovered that ordinary food tasted different when nobody was pretending to be invulnerable. "You can be strong and still need rest," Luna said, her eyes meeting the postmaster's with gentle accuracy, and he nodded while holding his sandwich like a small raft. Over the following months, the circles multiplied in quiet ways. Wednesday evenings at the library under Miss Vale's watchful kindness. Sunday afternoons at the community hall, where folding chairs clicked into place like patient metronomes. A once-a-month breakfast group at the Fisherman's Co-op that smelled of coffee and rope, and the practical love of people who relied on each other to come home safely. Sage began joining her regularly, bringing his gift for capturing complex feelings in accessible language. Together, they created what they called navigation guides, small booklets that combined Luna's practical techniques with his poetry, not as self-help manuals, but as gentle invitations to treat one's inner landscape with the same careful attention a lighthouse keeper brought to tending flame. The first guide, Breathing Like the Tide, contained simple exercises for finding rhythm in chaos, illustrated with Luna's maps of emotional currents and anchored by Sage's poems about the courage required to feel everything without being overwhelmed by anything. Luna learned as much as she taught. She discovered that too many circles in one weekend made her light smoke like an over-trimmed wick, and she learned to cancel without apology, posting notes in her careful handwriting, "Resting the lens tonight. Back soon." She learned to leave the island sometimes to teach at mainland clinics, where fluorescent lights hummed like anxious bees, bringing salt air into those rooms with bowls of sea glass and poems that opened windows where none had been. Her students came from all walks of life, drawn by quiet ripples of reputation rather than advertisement. Anxious teenagers overwhelmed by a world that demanded constant performance learned to chart their own emotional maps, identifying currents of worry and fear, while discovering the gentle channels that led toward calmer waters. Grieving widows found solace not in having their sorrow diminished, but in learning to create space for it, to sit with grief without being consumed by it. Burnt-out caregivers, exhausted by the relentless demands of compassion, learned the crucial importance of self-care, understanding that even lighthouses needed maintenance. People began calling her a healer, but Luna would smile and shake her head. "I'm a keeper," she said instead. "I take care of spaces where people can remember how to find themselves." When a reporter came looking for miracle language, Luna offered only practical weather. Most storms don't need heroics. They need handrails. A letter arrived from the Maritime Board with practical language and an official seal, acknowledgement of what the island already knew. "Keeper of record." Tobias sat with it in his lap for a long time, thumb smoothing the raised ink as if reading it by touch. "It was always you," he said, "not as farewell but as continuation. The way waves say the same sentence in new voices forever." As winter settled over the island, with its familiar invitation to deeper contemplation, Luna understood that she had become something she hadn't planned, but had been preparing for all her life, a teacher of gentle currents, showing others how to navigate the vast, beautiful, and sometimes overwhelming ocean of human connection. Her blue notebook, which had once held childhood maps of invisible currents, now contained detailed observations about the patterns that linked individual healing to community well-being, the ways that one person finding peace could create ripples that touched dozens of other lives. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal sweep across the dark waters, but now it carried a new message alongside its ancient promise of safe harbor. It spoke not just of guidance available to those who needed it, but of the possibility that everyone could learn to be a lighthouse keeper in their own right, tending whatever small portion of flame had been entrusted to their care, creating networks of light that could illuminate even the vastest darkness through the simple accumulation of individual beacons, burning steady and true. In her evening vigil, as she stood beside the great lens and felt its rhythm in her own body, Luna recognized that she was no longer just maintaining a tradition, but helping it evolve, showing others how the ancient art of lighthouse keeping could be practiced anywhere hearts needed guidance, through the mysterious passages of being human. The infinite madness, that beautiful recognition of universal connection, had revealed itself not as a burden to be carried alone, but as a practical foundation for communities where people could support each other through whatever storms might come. One gentle breath at a time, one small act of faithful presence at a time, one heart at a time, learning to navigate by the light of compassion rather than the harsh glare of judgment. On nights when fog lay low and the horn spoke in its patient syllables, Luna would feel the whole island lean into the beam's slow return, and she would think of the small cards tucked into wallets and taped to mirrors, the empty chairs at the edges of rooms where grief could rest. The way mustard on bread could become a kind of sacrament when people were brave enough to be ordinary together. She would think of Sage leaving folded poems in textbooks for strangers, each word a matched flame, and of all the quiet circles where people practiced their 3 breaths without needing her there. The work was simple in its profundity. Keep the light clear, mind the flame, hold steady when everything else was moving. But now Luna understood that this simplicity contained depths that connected. Her small lighthouse to every other beacon that had ever been, kindled by someone who understood that the antidote to darkness was not the elimination of shadow but the patient tending of whatever light had been entrusted to their care, one faithful revolution at a time, teaching others to tend their own flames while remaining connected to the endless, gentle ocean of compassion that held them all. The understanding that she had become a teacher of gentle currents carried Luna through the winter months with a sense of purpose that felt both earned and inevitable. But as spring arrived with its familiar promise of renewal, she began to notice subtle changes in Tobias that spoke of a different kind of transition, approaching with the quiet certainty of tides. His afternoon visits to the lighthouse cottage had grown shorter, his weathered hands requiring more rest between tasks, and his breathing carried a new quality of effort that spoke not of illness, but of a body that had served faithfully for 8 decades and was beginning to ask for different considerations. There was something in his eyes during those lengthening spring days, not sadness or fear, but a kind of soft rearranging, a settling that felt like the sea turning toward slack tide. He still came to the lamproom, still wrapped his hands around the teacup that steamed like a small prayer, still watched the beam sweep its faithful path with the particular satisfaction of a craftsman whose work had outlived strain. But Luna could feel him growing quieter, in ways that felt like preparation, his sentences carrying the shape of blessings, his silences holding the weight of things he wanted her to remember without the burden of formal instruction. One particularly clear afternoon, when the harbor sparkled with the kind of light that made everything seem possible, Tobias produced a small brass key from his sweater pocket, its surface worn smooth by decades of faithful service. "There's a drawer I never showed you," he said, his weathered voice carrying the particular gentleness he reserved for important gifts. "Bottom of the desk. A keeper's chest. Notes I never put in the official log." When Luna opened it later, she found not just technical observations, but pencil stubs and folded scraps of paper, thoughts too tender for inspection. Dates marked with only a star, recipes for soup and methods for mending torn nets with patience, a single pressed petal from a flower that only bloomed once a year. Alongside these treasures lay a leather-bound logbook that held the careful notations of every lighthouse keeper who had tended the beacon before him. Not just mechanical details, but gentle observations about human nature, weather patterns of the heart, and the kind of practical wisdom that could only be accumulated through years of faithful attention to both light and darkness. "The light doesn't belong to us," he said, as she reverently touched the worn pages. "We borrow it, tend it, and pass it on. The key opens more than storage. It opens the responsibility that comes with keeping light for others." They maintained their rituals through those final weeks, polishing, winding, trimming. But now Luna felt herself moving into the role of primary keeper, while Tobias settled into the gentler position of elder guide, offering wisdom when asked, but but trusting her competence in ways that spoke of deep satisfaction. They shared simple suppers at the tiny table: bread, cheese, a thin swipe of mustard that turned ordinary into something nearly ceremonial, and afterward climbed the spiral together, his hand never entirely leaving the rail. On a gentle evening in late spring, when the lighthouse beam swept across waters that held the promise of summer's warmth, Tobias passed peacefully in his sleep. Luna found him the next morning, his weathered hands folded over the wool blanket that had warmed countless keepers through countless storms, his face carrying the particular peace that comes to those who have completed their work with integrity and can rest knowing they have served well. Word traveled the way it always does in places small, enough to hold each other, through doors left ajar, through hands that paused halfway to their tasks, through coffee poured and then forgotten on counter edges. The day shaped itself around reverence. Nets returned to sheds, engines silenced, bread baked and wrapped in cloth. By afternoon, the path to the lighthouse was a thread of footsteps and murmurs, the air carrying that particular blend of salt and sorrow that makes even the most practical people speak softly. The community gathered at the cliff's edge while the tide turned invisible thought. Mrs. Cordelia began with a story about a night 4 decades ago when fog came with teeth, and Tobias kept the horn sounding so regularly that a captain later said it felt like a heartbeat he'd followed home. The postmaster spoke of doors fixed without being asked, of extra lanterns left on porches, of steady presence at the edges of urgent rooms. One by one, people offered the kind of memory that didn't need polishing, not grand heroism, but faithful presence. The countless nights he had climbed those spiral stairs to ensure safe passage for vessels they would never see. Sage read a brief poem, his voice barely above the wind. It did not name Tobias directly, but spoke of chairs still warm after someone stands, of the way a beam feels on your face even when you're looking away, of water remembering the hull of a boat. When he finished, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full and listening. Luna discovered that grief, like all the other emotions she had learned to navigate, required its own kind of lighthouse keeping. She practiced the keeper's rhythm during the moments when sorrow threatened to overwhelm her. Breathing in when facing toward gratitude for all Tobias had taught her, breathing out when releasing the sharp edge of loss that wanted to convince her she was now alone in her calling. The lighthouse itself seemed to carry its own kind of mourning, the great lens requiring more frequent attention, the clockwork mechanism needing gentler coaxing to maintain its steady rhythm. Her teaching circles took on new depth during this period of transition. People came not just seeking practical tools for emotional navigation, but drawn by the quality of presence that comes from someone who has learned to hold both light and shadow with equal tenderness. It was during one of these evening gatherings that Luna first noticed Iris, a young girl with dark eyes that held the same quality of intense attention Luna remembered from her own childhood. She was perhaps 8 years old, with the particular stillness that marked children who felt everything deeply. During their practice of the 3-breath anchor, Luna watched Iris place her small hand over her heart in a gesture that seemed both instinctive and profound. After the gathering, as people moved slowly toward the door with the reluctant pace of those who had found sanctuary, Iris lingered near the sea glass bowl, her small fingers tracing the smooth edges with the careful attention of someone reading stories in stone. "They hold light differently than regular glass," she said, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone children use for obvious truths, like they've learned something from being tumbled by waves that makes them gentler. Luna knelt beside her, recognizing in this observation the same quality of perception that had guided her own childhood understanding of the world's invisible currents. When she asked what else Iris noticed, the child replied with wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. People carry storms inside sometimes, but they also carry light. It's always there, even when they forget. Like the lighthouse beam is always turning, even when fog makes it hard to see. In that moment, Luna understood that the cycle was continuing, that the ancient tradition of lighthouse keeping was finding its next expression through this sensitive child who already understood truths that most adults spent years learning to accept. She thought of Tobias, of all the keepers who had come before, of the endless succession of lights that had been tended by people who understood that the work was never really about the individual keeper, but about maintaining something essential that transcended any single lifetime. As the lighthouse beam made its faithful sweep across the dark waters that night, Luna stood in the lamp room with the brass key warm in her palm and the leather logbook open to its first blank page. She began writing her own entry, not just the technical notations that marked the passing of days, but the deeper observations that would guide whoever came after her. Near the door she had placed a small drawing that Iris had left behind, a careful sketch of the lighthouse beam touching a little house on the cliff. With the words, "Sometimes I think the light hears me," written in a child's careful script. The work was simple in its profundity. Keep the light clear, mind the flame, hold steady when everything else was moving. But now Luna understood that this simplicity contained depths that connected every keeper to every other keeper across time, all of them part of an endless conversation about what it meant to serve something larger than themselves. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal sweep, carrying its message across the dark waters. You are not alone. You are seen, you are loved. And in that patient light, Luna felt herself becoming part of something both ancient and eternally new, a keeper of light, who had learned to tend not just a physical beacon, but the deeper flame that helps hearts remember their way home to themselves and to each other. The infinite madness, that beautiful recognition of universal connection, had revealed itself not as a burden to be carried alone, but as a practical foundation for communities where people could support each other through whatever storms might come. One gentle revolution at a time, one steady breath at a time, one heart at a time, learning to navigate by the light of compassion rather than the harsh glare of judgment. Outside, the sea continued its eternal dialogue with the shore. Inside, the newest lighthouse keeper tended her flame with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her place in the endless conversation between light and darkness, guided by the understanding that even in the vastest night, someone is always watching, always keeping the light, always calling lost souls safely home. The understanding that the cycle was continuing through Iris had settled into Luna's awareness like sediment, finding its proper depth. And as the weeks following Tobias's peaceful passing shaped themselves around new rhythms, the young girl began appearing at the lighthouse cottage with the natural inevitability of tides. She arrived not with the urgent need of someone seeking comfort, but with the quiet purposefulness of someone who had always known this path was waiting for her to discover it. Luna found herself adjusting to the new shape of her days by placing one gentle thing after another. Where grief had left its tender gaps, fresh oil in the small amber bottle, a folded cloth beside the great lens, the brass key resting where her hand would find it without looking. The lighthouse beam continued its patient sentences across the water, and she learned to let its steady cadence guide her thoughts toward what was being born rather than what had been lost. Iris began visiting without invitation, arriving with that careful attention children sometimes carry when they have decided on a secret project. Though she did not yet know that she was the project, and the lighthouse was simply the place where it could bloom, Luna kept her welcome simple. A small stool pulled close to the worn wooden desk, a tin of colored pencils waiting like old friends, an extra cup set beside the kettle as if it had been there all along. When Iris sat, she did so with the solemnity of someone taking a vow. Her small hands folded, her dark eyes absorbing not just the room but the spaces between objects where deeper meanings lived. They climbed the spiral stairs together with practiced slowness, Luna's palm hovering behind Iris's shoulder without touching, present not pressing. At the landing where a round window faced the harbor, Luna taught her the keeper's rhythm that had once steadied her own overwhelming sensitivity. "In when the light turns toward us," she whispered, her voice carrying the same patient tone Tobias had used years ago. "Out when it turns toward the sea. Let the world move around you without asking it to move through you." Iris nodded with a seriousness that made Luna's heart ache in the most forgiving way, the ache that says, yes, this is how we continue. The lessons unfolded in ordinary disguises, the soft brush and tiny bottle of oil becoming instruments in a child's careful orchestra, the great lens a galaxy Iris learned to polish, until stars seemed to gather in its grooves. Luna taught her to listen for the clockwork's honest resistance, to hear the difference between steady tick and the almost silent unevenness that meant attention was needed. But more than technical skills, Luna shared the deeper wisdom that had sustained her through years of faithful service. "A lighthouse doesn't chase after ships in trouble," she found herself saying one evening, as they watched the beam cut through gathering dusk. "It stands steady and lets its light be seen by those who need guidance. Your gift is like a well. It has great depth, but it also has limits. Draw from it wisely, and it will never run dry." She taught Iris to recognize the subtle physical sensations that warned when she was giving too much of herself, the faint hum behind her eyes, the way her own feelings became muddied when she tried to carry others' emotional weight. They practiced boundaries as a skill, standing at the window frame with palms on wood, learning to hear loneliness without swallowing it, to witness pain without taking it on as personal cargo. The true test came during a particularly difficult afternoon when young Leo from the village school arrived at their door with tears streaming down his face. Overwhelmed by his parents' fighting and his own sense of helplessness, Luna watched as Iris instinctively moved toward him, then paused, remembering the lessons about sustainable service. Instead of trying to absorb his distress, Iris simply sat beside him and began humming that same wordless melody that had accompanied Luna's birth, creating space for Leo's sobs to find their own rhythm and eventually quiet. "You didn't try to fix him," Luna observed afterward, and Iris nodded with understanding beyond her years. "I just sat with him until he remembered he was okay underneath the scared part. Like you taught me, the light is always there, even when fog makes it hard to see." During her evening vigils in the lamp room, as the great lens made its patient rotations and the beam swept across waters that held the stories of countless journeys, Luna began to understand that she was witnessing something both ancient and eternally new. The tradition of lighthouse keeping was finding its next expression not just through the technical maintenance of the beacon, but through the deeper wisdom of recognizing when others possessed the same calling. She thought of all the quiet circles where people now practiced their 3 breaths without needing her there, all the small flames that had been kindled from the steady light she had learned to tend. The infinite madness, that beautiful recognition of universal connection, had revealed itself through her life as practical wisdom that could be shared, that taught and passed on like any other essential skill. One particularly clear night, when stars seemed close enough to touch and the sea held their reflection like scattered diamonds, Luna stood beside Iris in the lamp room and felt the profound satisfaction of completion. Not ending, but fulfillment. The recognition that she had become what she was always meant to be, and that the light would continue to shine long after any individual keeper had completed their watch. "The work is never really finished," she said softly, placing her hand on Iris's small shoulder. "Each generation learns to tend the light in their own way, but the purpose stays the same, helping others remember they're not alone in the darkness." In her small blue notebook, Iris had begun drawing maps of her own, careful sketches that showed not just where emotional currents flowed, but the gentle channels that helped hearts connect across the vast ocean of human experience. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal sweep, touching each drawing with light that seemed to bless the work of understanding that was already beginning in this new young keeper. Luna felt herself settling into the role of elder guide, learning to trust Iris's natural competence while offering wisdom when asked. The brass key that Tobias had given her now rested warm in Iris's small palm, carrying the promise of responsibilities that would unfold as naturally as seasons change. Outside, the sea continued its eternal conversation with the shore, and inside, 2 keepers, one seasoned, one beginning, maintained their vigil together, both part of an endless succession of lights tended by people who understood that the work was never really about the individual keeper, but about maintaining something essential that transcended any single lifetime. The beam swept across the dark waters, carrying its eternal message: "You are not alone, you are seen, you are loved." And in that patient light, Luna understood that she had become part of something both timeless and eternally renewable. A tradition that would continue as long as hearts needed help remembering their way home to the tender mystery of connection, one gentle revolution at a time. Years had settled over the lighthouse like layers of sea glass, each season adding its own gentle polish, until time itself seemed to move with the measured patience of tides. Luna, now in her 30s with hands that carried the same steady competence Tobias had once possessed, found herself naturally stepping into the role of elder guide, as Iris grew into her calling with the organic grace of someone who had always been walking toward this particular destiny. The brass key had begun spending more time in Iris's pocket, warming against her palm during their evening vigils in the lamp room. At 18, she moved through the lighthouse rituals with a reverence that spoke of deep understanding rather than mere technique. When she polished the great lens, each circular motion carried the same meditative quality Luna remembered from her own apprenticeship. When she wound the clockwork mechanism, her listening fingers found the rhythm that felt like breathing, the pace that honored both precision and patience. The teaching circles had grown beyond anything Luna could have imagined during those early gatherings in the lighthouse cottage. What had begun as small groups of islanders seeking comfort during difficult seasons had blossomed into a network of gentle sanctuaries that stretched across the mainland and beyond. Sage, whose poetry had helped so many find language for feelings they couldn't name, now traveled regularly to distant cities, where overwhelmed souls gathered in libraries and community centers, seeking not miraculous healing, but practical wisdom for navigating the vast emotional currents of modern life. Luna's blue notebook, which had once held her childhood maps of invisible feelings, now served as a template for dozens of others who had learned to chart their own emotional territories, with the same careful attention she had brought to understanding the island's hidden currents. The navigation guides she and Sage had created together traveled far beyond their shores, tucked into backpacks and briefcases, shared in coffee shops and waiting rooms, creating quiet ripples of understanding that touched lives in ways they could observe but never fully track. On a particularly clear evening in late spring, when the sea held that perfect shade of blue found between sky and song, Luna made a decision that felt both momentous and utterly natural. She found Iris in the lamp room, carefully adjusting the wick with the same focused attention Luna had learned from Tobias decades ago, and placed the brass key in her palm with the ceremonial weight of something that had always been waiting for this exact moment. "Tonight, you keep the vigil alone," Luna said, her voice carrying the same gentle authority Tobias had used when teaching her the keeper's rhythm. Not as a test, but as recognition. "The light knows your hands now." Iris accepted the key with the solemnity of someone receiving a sacred trust, her dark eyes reflecting the same quality of attention that had guided Luna through years of faithful service. They climbed the spiral stairs together one final time, as keeper and apprentice, their footsteps echoing with the countless others who had made this ascent before them. At the midway landing, where the round window faced the harbor, Luna rested her hand against the cool stone and felt the lighthouse's deep hum, the same note it had sung through storms and calm alike. "Remember," she said, placing her weathered hand briefly on Iris's shoulder, "the keeper's rhythm. In when the light turns toward you, out when it turns toward the sea. Let what isn't yours pass like ships you acknowledge but do not board. Your job is not to carry their cargo, but to help them navigate their own way through the narrow passages." As Luna walked back toward the village, the lighthouse beam began its eternal sweep behind her, tended now by hands that had learned not just the technical skills, but the deeper wisdom of what it meant to keep light for others. She felt no sadness in this transition, only the profound satisfaction that comes from understanding that the work was never really about any individual keeper, but about maintaining something essential that transcended any single lifetime. At her cottage window, Luna lit her own small lamp and arranged her collection of sea glass where the lighthouse beam could find it during its patient rotations. She made a simple supper, bread, cheese, a thin swipe of mustard that turned ordinary into something nearly ceremonial, and carried it to the chair where she had once sat with grief, but now found only peaceful contemplation. The infinite madness she understood with crystalline clarity was simply love, vast, overwhelming, connecting everything to everything else in patterns too beautiful and complex for any single mind to fully comprehend. It was not a burden to be carried alone, but a practical truth to be recognized and shared, the foundation for communities where people could support each other through whatever storms might come. She had learned to be a small part of that pattern, a gentle guide for others navigating the mysterious waters of human connection. Her blue notebook lay open on the small table, its final pages filled with observations that would guide whoever came after her. "The light doesn't belong to us," she had written, echoing Tobias's words from years past. "We borrow it, tend it, and pass it on. The greatest discovery is learning that everyone carries their own beacon, their own capacity to be a lighthouse, keeper in whatever circumstances they find themselves navigating." As night deepened and the lighthouse beam swept across waters that sparkled with the promise of countless journeys yet to be taken, Luna felt herself settling into the deepest peace available to human hearts. She had served something larger than herself, with integrity and love, and the light would continue to shine long after any individual keeper had completed their watch. From her window, she could see the lighthouse beam cutting through the gentle darkness with unwavering purpose, touching each cottage window like a blessing, each boat in the harbor like a reassuring hand on a shoulder. Iris was there in the lamproom, tending the flame with the same patient devotion that had sustained keepers for generations, part of an endless succession of lights tended by people who understood that the work was sacred, not because it was grand, but because it was faithful. The sea continued its eternal conversation with the shore, and Luna closed her eyes, letting her familiar hum find its rhythm with the lighthouse's own deep song. She felt herself becoming part of the eternal constellation of lightkeepers, all tending their own flames, while remaining connected to the vast, gentle ocean of compassion that held them all. The infinite madness flowed on, beautiful and terrible and tender, connecting every soul to every other soul in the endless dance of being human. And somewhere in that patient light, Luna continued her quiet work of helping others remember that they were never alone. Never unseen, never unloved, that even in the vastest darkness, someone was always tending the light that called lost hearts safely home to the tender mystery of connection, one gentle revolution at a time, one steady breath at a time, one small act of faithful presence at a time. The lighthouse beam swept across the dark waters, carrying its eternal message. You are not alone, you are seen, you are loved. And somewhere she's still out there, tending the beam in all the quiet ways that light travels from heart to heart, keeping company with the patient, understanding that helps us all remember our way home to ourselves. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay.